Good afternoon, everyone watching online here in the Philippines and abroad. Welcome to the Development Academy of the Philippines Public Sector Productivity webinars. My name is Gerard Calambro, and let me welcome my co-moderator, Mr. Michael Angelo Sarabia. Good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Sir Gerard, and good afternoon, everyone, to our viewers from all over the Philippines.
So let's give them a shout out. So we would like to welcome our participants from the Philippine International Trading Corporation, the Provincial Engineers Office of Palawan. We also have the Center for International Trade and Expositions and Missions from the DTI, the Cultural Center of the Philippines. We also have participants from the Philippine National Police Aviation Security Group, the Mindanao Development Authority, the Department of Finance, the National Police Commission, the Department of Energy, the National Home Mortgage and Finance Corporation, students and teachers from the Rizal Technological University, the Maritime Industry Authority, the Commission on Elections, the University of Rizal System, the Department of Education, the University of the Philippines Media and Public Relations Office, and the Iloilo Science and Technology University. Again, good afternoon. So as the Center of Excellence on Public Sector Productivity, the DOT is hosting this webinar series. It will be provided a general understanding of an anti-bribery management system. Our resource speaker is an integrated management system specialist of the Academy. We'd like to welcome Mr. Antonio P. Santos. Good afternoon, Sir Tony.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Gerard. Good afternoon.
All right, so we can hear you loud and clear. So can we start, sir?
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Antonio Santos. I'm an integrated management system consultant who assists organizations to establish management systems of different discipline, quality, environmental management system, including health and safety management system. And for this webinar about introducing a new management system standard. This standard provides a globally accepted approach to address a menace to society and the economy that erodes political stability, increases cost of business, and contributes to poverty. This international standard is the ISO 37001 2016 Anti-Bribery Management System Standard. For this webinar, we intend to provide the participants a general understanding of the requirements of the Anti-Bribery Management System Standard, uh, the key steps in establishing an anti-bribery management system, and key operational controls prescribed by the standard to manage bribery. And I believe most of the participants here are already exposed in implementing a quality management system. Uh, we will also provide you a roadmap on how your existing quality management system can be merged into this anti-bribery management system. I believe you have heard or seen a lot of news about unscrupulous activities in transacting on many government agencies. Here are examples of those unscrupulous activities, or maybe we can call them corruption cases. There are news about a department who has undocumented expenses that amounts to almost 13.9 billion pesos. No? And currently, maybe you have heard uh, there are problems in their learning materials about these double meaning dirty names. No? There's also a case about a Chinese gambling tycoon who was charged for bribing immigration officials to release illegal Chinese workers. The bribe went as high as 50 million pesos. Uh, in another department, the late secretary before was offered 6 million monthly, no, by a mining firm. And there's another story about a mining firm that bribes village officials to secure endorsement for its application for renewal of permit. Another story is about a Chinese nationals who were allegedly given special treatment in exchange for 10,000. So this is a well-known news, and Greece money is called the pastillas money. Another story about revenue officials that were charged for demanding 2 million from a company to settle tax liabilities. So there are a lot of corruption cases. And another one in sometime in July 2013 about a woman who was accused of masterminding a scam using this network of bogus NGOs that funnels 10 billion pesos from this development fund of our lawmakers to ghost projects in exchange of massive kickbacks. And there is a story about on news about GCTA, which was exploited by influential criminals to bribe their way out of jail. Sometime in August 2019, the impending release of this former mayor convicted of rape and slay crime sparked legal inquiries. And another one is about grease money that ranges from 5,000 to 50,000 per shipping container. So this is about the TARA system in one bureau. And then maybe you have also heard about this extortion activities district engineer who demands 10 million from contractors to ensure the awarding of these development projects. So we have so much of that. Stories of corruption, news of corruption. A German-based NGO's yearly survey on the measure of perception on corruption all over the world has scored the Philippines 34 on their corruption perception index. So what does 34 mean? From a perfect score of 100, which is very clean, to 0, which is highly corrupt. No? So we have a score of 34. You'll notice also in this slide the color coding. Philippines has a color dark orange, far from the light color, which is yellow. The score put the Philippines in the 113th rank. We are tied with an African country, Zambia. So most of the countries in the Europe and the North America scored higher than the rest of the world. Nevertheless, though the Philippines has a low score compared to the first world countries, the trend since 2000 up to the present shows that we are improving. We are improving. This trend is how we can say that the Western power countries see us in terms of their corruption perception index. Another survey, this time from a Hong Kong-based consultancy firm about perception of corruption in the Asian region, countries that are our neighbors, place the Philippines in the middle. So place the Philippines in the middle. This Hong Kong-based consultancy firm provide grades from 0 to 10. From 0 to 10. 10 being the worst. 10 being the worst, 0 being the best. From the perception of our Asian neighbors, the Philippines is improving. If we can see the trend, no? The trend from 2009 towards 2018 shows that the perception grade is going down, going to zero, going to zero. So we need to hit zero. So I believe both surveys, the European surveys and this Hong Kong-based survey, agree that the Philippines corruption metric is improving, but of course, we still have a long way to go. However, there are limitations in the perception indices. No? There's a big difference about perception and actual level of corruption. Perception is, of course, opinion-based, and perceptions can be shaped. No? Surveys are actually public relations tool, and because it's a public relations tool, surveys can be manipulated. No? Surveys can be manipulated. So right now on social media, it contributes a lot in spreading claims by whistleblowers, but also fraudsters. No? Fake news is very rampant nowadays. So because of these limitations, there are times that the surveys might understate or exaggerate the actual level of corruption. For example, there are worse type of corruption that can go undetected. Usually, this is done in the highest level. For example, onerous sovereign guarantee. No? A friendly government administration can discharge the liability of the borrower in case the borrower defaults. No? And there are times sensationalism by political rivals exaggerate corruption levels. Some of the accusations, of course, are true, but many are false. But the public is fed with this steady diet of sensational news that highlight or even exaggerates corruption problems. Since there's no standard definition of the word corruption, allow me to borrow the Transparency International's definition. So corruption here is defined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So there are types of corruption. I'm using the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, no, for their definitions. So grand corruption pervades the highest level of a national government, leading to broad erosion of confidence in good governance. So what are the examples of this grand corruption? I have mentioned a while ago that onerous sovereign guarantee is an example of a grand corruption. No? Pork barrels can be an example of grand corruption. Another one is the petty corruption. Exchange of very small amounts of money, granting of minor favors by those seeking preferential treatment. So what are the examples of this petty corruption? Examples, gifts, treats, dealing with fixers, maybe pastillas. Pastillas in the immigration is an example of petty corruption. Embezzlement, taking of money, property, or valuable items by an individual who is not entitled to them, but by virtue of his or her position has access to them. So examples of this embezzlement, it can start from small pilferage, supplies of an organization being pilfered, to an accountant remitting $1 million of money. I've heard that in one country, I believe in Singapore. And then there is extortion. Extortion relies on coercion, such as the use of threat to induce cooperation. So some examples I mentioned earlier about the district engineers are demanding 10 million to award a contract. For bribery, the standard ISO 37001 has a definition. ISO 37001 defines bribery as offering, promising, giving, accepting, or soliciting of an undue advantage of any value, which could be financial or non-financial, directly or indirectly, and irrespective of locations in violation of applicable law, as an inducement or reward for a person acting or refraining from acting in relation to the performance of that person's duties. So we have a lot of names in bribery like grease money, tara, pastillas, kotong, etc. So bribery has so many names. In our legal system, bribery has different types. According to the revised penal code, according to the revised penal code, there are these types of bribery. One is direct bribery. Any public officer who shall agree to perform an act constituting a crime in connection with the performance of his official duties in consideration of any offer, promise, gift, or present received by such officer personally or through the mediation of another is a direct bribery. And this direct bribery, you will get a penalty of prison mayor. Prison mayor in its medium and maximum periods. So when you say medium, it can go to 8 years and 1 day to as long as 10 years. Maximum period or maximum term for prison mayor will start in 10 years and 1 day to 12 years. So if the direct bribery have not been accomplished, so you will get a penalty of prison correctional in its medium period. It's in its medium period. When we say medium, so you can go to prison for 2 years to 4 months and 1 day to 4 years and 2 months. Indirect bribery is about any public officer who shall accept gifts offered to him by reason of his office. So if you have this kind of bribery, you will get a penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods. So when we say medium, you will get 2 years to 4 months and 1 day to 4 years and 2 months to 4 years and 2 months. For the maximum term, you will get 4 years, 2 months, and 1 day to 6 years. And there's another type of bribery under the revised penal code, the qualified bribery. So if you incur or if you commit this type of bribery, you shall suffer the penalty for the offense which was not prosecuted. You can be in prison for 20 years and 1 day to 40 years. Now, why? Because the definition of disqualified bribery is any public officer entrusted with law enforcement and refrains from arresting or prosecuting an offender who has committed a crime punishable by reclusion perpetua. So if you refuse to arrest that offender, you will get the penalty for that offender. So aside from the law, the revised penal code, there are management system approaches that can help us in combating this bribery. By considering the international agreements, the UN conventions, the OECD conventions. OECD means Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So these conventions with the national laws and regulations, the RA 3019 or the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, and of course the revised penal code. So this can be taken into account, and then a management system can be established for this. And usually these management systems are structured using the PDCA cycle. So the intended outcomes for an anti-bribery management system will include prevention, detection, and response to bribery. And another one is about compliance with anti-bribery laws and voluntary commitments applicable to the organization's activities. So what is this ISO 37001, which is an anti-bribery management system? So this standard specifies requirements and provides guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, reviewing, and improving an anti-bribery management system. So the system can be standalone or can be integrated with the existing management systems or into your business processes. The requirements of ISO 37001 are generic and are intended to be applicable to all types of organizations. So this standard is applicable to public, private, small, medium, large organizations, profit, non-profit organizations. So it's applicable to any organization who wants to address bribery risk or even other corruption. ISO 37001 addresses the following in relation to organizations' activities. Bribery in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. Bribery by the organization. So what does that mean? Active bribery. When we say active bribery, if the organization is the one paying the bribe. No? If the organization is the one paying the bribe. Bribery of the organization, which is a passive bribery, if the organization is the one at the receiving end of the bribe. So that's passive bribery, bribery of the organization. And it also addresses, this standard also addresses the direct and indirect bribery. No? For example, a bribe offered or accepted through or by a third party. So some frequently asked questions about ISO 37001. First, how will ISO 37001 benefit an organization? So it's a risk management tool and brings assurance to stakeholders that organizations taking reasonable steps to prevent, detect, and appropriately manage bribery risk. So it's a tool. Another question, does conformity with ISO 37001 guarantee that bribery will not occur? Of course, no. Even in other organizations' management system. So if you're certified to ISO 9001, which is a quality management system, it doesn't mean that your system is perfect and all your products and services will conform to the requirements, or you will have perfect products or perfect services. So for ISO 37001, of course, if you have an ISO 37001, it doesn't guarantee that bribery will not occur. No? But it can provide assurance that bribery will be addressed. No? It can help the organization to prevent, to detect, and respond to bribery risks and strengthen the anti-bribery culture. Next question, can an organization be certified to ISO 37001? Yes. No? Since ISO 37001 is a requirement standard, so you can be certified, or the organizations can be certified against this standard. In ISO, there are guideline standard and there are requirement standards. So ISO 37001 is one of the requirement standards. The ISO organization conducts surveys about how many certificates that were issued to around the world. Right now, of course, ISO 9001 certificate has the most number of certificates issued to so many organizations. Here, you can see that ISO 37001 has 872 total valid certificates around the world. So the ISO 37001 is just new. So later on, I hope many organizations will find the value of establishing this anti-bribery management system. So if we will try to break down these 872 certificates around the world into the countries that have certificates of ISO 37001. So Italy has the most number of certificates for ISO 37001. So Italy has 329. The Philippines, we only have one. No? We only have one certificate. A private organization is certified against this 37001 anti-bribery management system. I believe it's the AGNP. It's a private organization. So similar with the different management systems standards, ISO 37001 has a set of requirements that we need to satisfy. No? The first one is about you need to have a documented scope for your anti-bribery management system. So this one has an asterisk. So I put an asterisk here because I believe this requirement can be integrated with any management system, with any management system requirements. So the next one is the regular bribery assessment, regular bribery risk assessment. It can also be integrated. Another one, ensuring integration of the ABMS requirements into the organization's processes. So it's about integration. So it can be, of course, integrated. Documented anti-bribery policy, assigned persons to oversee the anti-bribery management system, so it can be integrated also. The documented anti-bribery policy, it's difficult to integrate that into another policy because, of course, if you want to have focus, it's better to have a separate policy on your management system. So if you have an existing quality policy, so it should be separated from that. The next set, the plan, integrate, and implement actions to address bribery risks and opportunities can be integrated with any management system. Documented information on anti-bribery management system objectives can be integrated also in other management system standards. Anti-bribery controls on human resources can be integrated to another. Controls on documented information management can be integrated also. Due diligence on projects and business associates. So that's unique for anti-bribery management system. Financial and non-financial controls. I believe a bit unique, but it can also be integrated. Implementation of anti-bribery controls on controlled organizations. What do we mean by controlled organizations? Our partners, suppliers, affiliates. So you can implement your anti-bribery controls on them. Anti-bribery controls on gifts, hospitality, raising concerns, investigation. That could be unique for anti-bribery. Anti-bribery management system, internal audit, and management review can be integrated with any management system standard. The corrective action and continual improvement requirement in anti-bribery management system can also be integrated. So we have a lot of opportunities here to integrate these major requirements of ISO 37001 with any existing management system. So those are the requirements. Right now, I will show you the major clauses of ISO 37001. So ISO 37001 has 10 clauses. The requirements will start at clause number 4 up to clause number 10. These clauses are structured using the PDCA cycle. So you will notice here that clause number 4, 5, 6 up to 7 is under the plan stage of the PDCA cycle. The middle of 7 up to 8 is at the do stage of the PDCA cycle. Then, of course, the check part of the PDCA cycle will cover the performance and evaluation clauses of ISO 37001, and the act stage of the PDCA cycle covers the improvement clauses of ISO 37001. How can we implement or how can we establish these anti-bribery management system. So we can make use of the PDCA approach in identifying what are the steps or what are the activities to be undertaken to implement or to establish an anti-bribery management system. So I'm showing you here the steps from 1 to 11 if you want to be certified to the standard. So number 1 is you have to define the context. No? Number 2, you have to define the scope of the ABMS. Number 3, you have to determine the bribery risk to be managed. Number 4, you will have to establish your intended outcome. So that would mean establishing your policy, your objectives. No? Number 5 is about assigning roles, responsibilities, and authorities. 6, you have to identify now here the risk at the operational level, the risk and opportunities at the operational level, and the actions to address them. Now, that's why you have to plan the actions to achieve the intended outcomes. Step number seven is you have to support the ABMS and its processes. So what should be the activities within sub-activities within step number 7? You will have to document. You will have to provide resources. When you say provide resources, it will include people, infrastructure, so those things, no? Under number 7. Under step number 8, you will now have to implement the controls that you have identified to address the risk or the anti-bribery or the bribery risk, no? In number 7. So you will now have to implement that in step number 8. And then step number 9, so you will need to check if you are implementing it correctly. So that would be number 9. So in number 9, so the internal audit, the activities, the monitoring and measurement activities, the management review activities are included in step number 9. And then in step number 10, so after you have identified your shortcomings, or maybe you have identified nonconformities or areas for improvement during your audit or during your review of your ABMS. So you will now have to implement actions to improve your ABMS. That's step number 7. And then once you have undergone step number 1 to step number 10, you can now proceed to certification. So from the 10 steps, so I'll try to provide additional information about step number 1 and step number 2. So let's start with step number 1. No? Step number 1 is about defining the context of the organization. In defining the context of the organization, there are 2 clauses that you will need to make sure you understand. No? 4.1 and 4.2 of this standard. So clause number 4.1 is about understanding the context. You are required to determine the external and internal issues relevant to the purpose, no? Relevant to the purpose of the organization. When we say purpose of the organization, usually the purpose of the organization will be based from your mission, mandate, vision. So those can serve as purpose of the organization. In clause number 4.2, you are required to understand the needs and expectations of the stakeholders. So you have to determine the stakeholders first, and then the requirements of these stakeholders. So later on, the planned results, the outcomes, the objectives, the expected outputs of your processes will be anchored in these stakeholders' requirements. In understanding the context of the organization or understanding the issues, no? Internal, external issues that will affect your approach in developing and achieving objectives, you need to identify issues that are relevant to your purpose. For example, you have this mission, no? This mission, sample mission, provide and manage quality infrastructure, facilities, and services responsive to the needs of the Filipino people in the pursuit of national development objectives. I believe this one, I get it from a department, no, of Public Works and Highways, no, the DPWH, no, sample mission. So if they have this sample mission, if they have this mission, so they may have these issues, no, relevant to their mission. Now, for example, the head of the field office, no, can influence awarding contracts. Monitoring of local projects at distant places can be an issue for them. The organization by itself lacks the technology to undertake modern projects, so that could be an issue. The organization sets the specifications, but the project execution requires contractors. That can be issues. That can be an issue to them. Approval of operational budget by legislators with, of course, parochial agenda. Of course, if a lawmaker, a congressman, would like his or her constituents to be prioritized, so it can affect their objective. Another, most projects are completed by contractors, not them, so it can be an issue for them. And then there are times that the LGU chief recommend contractors. Another issue is the prepared contractor might have infraction on labor laws. So there are also, of course, there are a lot of issues that they need to consider. These are just examples. These are just examples. So this can affect their approach on establishing and achieving their set ABMS objectives. So that's why they need to determine these issues, internal and external issues. In determining the stakeholders' needs and expectations, clause number 4.2, no? The needs and expectations of the interested parties, this is just an example, no, for your reference. Example here, interested party could be the appointing official. What are the requirements or the needs and expectations of this interested party? Appointee as head of office, they expect them to exhibit sound judgment both legally and in codes of corporate governance in fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities of corporate governance and oversight. So that can affect their setting of ABMS objectives. Another interested party could be the regulatory bodies. For example, here, civil service, the Anti-Red Tape Act, that can also affect their ABMS objectives. Example of the requirement of these regulatory bodies: public officials and employees shall not solicit or accept directly or indirectly any gift, gratuity, favor, entertainment. So it is written in RA 6713, Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials and Employees. Another one is criminal liability shall also be incurred through the commission of bribery, extortion, or when the violation was done deliberately and maliciously. So under RA 11032, or the Ease of Doing Business and Efficient Government Service Act. These requirements can affect the organization setting of their ABMS objectives. So that's why they have to understand first the needs and expectations of their interested parties. And earlier, they need to understand also the internal and external issues. These two, the needs and expectations, internal and external issues, compose the context of the organization. So the context of the organization, which consists of the internal and external issues and the needs and expectations of interested parties. So once this is well established and clearly understood, it will help the organization to fulfill the other requirements under the ISO 37001 standard. So what are the other requirements that can be fulfilled effectively if the context is very clear? The scope of the ABMS, the scope of your anti-bribery management system will be better defined. Another, your anti-bribery policy. When you plan for your anti-bribery management system, you can easily identify what will be your planned results, outcomes, expected outputs, or objectives. And of course, the anti-bribery objectives. No? Usually, uh, the anti-bribery objectives will be anchored on the needs and expectations of the interested parties. And then, during your review of your anti-bribery management system, to know if your anti-bribery management system is still suitable, effective, and adequate, so you will need to revisit your internal and external issues, and check if you are satisfying the needs and expectations of your interested parties. So by knowing, by understanding the context of the organization, so you can effectively fulfill the other requirements of the standard. The second step that I can provide you additional information is about defining the scope of the ABMS. So why do we need to define this scope? Why do we need to establish this? No? Because if you want to be certified against ISO 37001, it's a requirement by certifying bodies that you need to agree with the scope of certification or scope of registration. So this will also define the processes to which the organization's ABMS is applicable and against which it will be assessed. No? Once you have defined the scope, all the processes within the scope will now be covered during the audit. So for this example of a certificate, so the scope is written usually in the middle or at the lower. So here are just examples of the scopes that were certified under ISO 37001, an organization named KFIR SA. The scope of their ABMS that was certified is anti-bribery management systems in the scope of design and construction of insulation, refractory, corrosion protection, and fireproofing, scaffolding, general construction, and facade for regular and industrial building. They are a construction company. And another one, Malaysia Marine and Heavy Engineering Holding, anti-bribery management systems for marine operations and heavy engineering operations. Another one, the SOLMAS, anti-bribery management systems with the scope of foreign trade, custom clearances, and all logistics. So it's a logistic company, and this is an example of their scope of registration. Similar with any other management system, the scope must be documented. And in documenting the scope of your anti-bribery management system, you will have to consider the internal and external issues, the requirements of stakeholders, and the results of risk assessment. This one is unique for ISO 37001, unlike with the other management system. In most of the standards, ISO standards, in developing or in documenting the scope, you will only need to consider internal and external issues, the requirements of stakeholders. But for 37001, you have to consider also the results of risk assessment. So in developing the scope of the anti-bribery management system, so one requirement is you have to take into consideration the results of the risk bribery risk assessment. So this is just an example of a bribery risk assessment tool. In this example, for every function, so you will need to identify the risk, the bribery risk in every function. You have to identify also who will be affected, who can be affected by this bribery risk. So you have to identify those. And then you have to identify also what are your existing controls that will address this bribery risk. And you will also need to know what improvements can be done in addressing this bribery risk. So once you have identified this the bribery risk in your organization, you can now identify what are the processes to be included within the scope of your anti-bribery management system. Of course, those functions with a high level of risk, anti-bribery risk, will need to be included into your anti-bribery management system scope. So that's why in documenting the anti-bribery management system scope, you will need to consider the result of the bribery risk assessment. So here are some of the anti-bribery management system operational controls that I can share to you. So after you have identified the bribery risk, so a requirement of ISO 37001 is you need to identify the actions to address those bribery risks. And these are some of the examples of operational controls to address the bribery risk. Now, first one is about employment procedure. Now, in the employment procedure, you can include the following approaches. The conduct of due diligence on persons before they are employed or before they are transferred or promoted. So you will need to check, investigate no, these people. You can also include this provision in your procedure of employment that you have the right to discipline personnel in case they incur violation against your anti-bribery management system policies. So for financial controls, so you can include the following approaches. Of course, checks and balances, counter signatures, or thresholds for approval. So usually, somebody higher in position can approve more costly expenditures. So that's why you need to have this threshold for approvals. In controlling the cash, so you can include restriction of the cash use actually. So instead of using cash, so you can make use of check or electronic payments. No? And you need to require receipts no, from officials. And no off the book accounts. So when we say no off the book accounts, all expenditures must be accounted. Must be logged into your book of accounts. For non-financial controls, you can include this into your existing practice. The use of contractors that have undergone strict pre-qualification process. I believe RA 9184 may have already established the controls no, that might go against the anti-bribery management system policies. Another one here, awarding contracts after a fair and transparent competitive bidding process has taken place. So similar with RA 9184. So if you are compliant with RA 9184, the Government Procurement Act, so you can easily manage, you can easily address anti-bribery risk. No? You can easily address bribery risk no? in non-financial controls. Another one, you can have this anti-bribery commitment for all the business associates. No? For all the business associates. So when we say business associates, it will include contractors, third parties, partners, including employees as business associate. So you can have this commitment that is made formally with written approval by the head of the organization. And in that commitment, you can also include this zero tolerance of bribery, part of that commitment. So they have to sign this one. Next control is about raising concerns or whistleblowing. In this set of controls, you can add to your existing system the following. You can provide a range of channels, hotlines, direct access to higher management if there are issues that should be communicated to the management if there will be issues about bribery. So you can also add on the policies on raising concerns or whistleblowing that those who will speak will not be harassed or penalized, but they will be recognized or rewarded for their efforts. You can also include the option for reporting anonymously. Another control or operational control for anti-bribery is about anti-bribery investigations. Whenever there will be incidents of bribery, so you will need to set a procedure that investigators will need to be independent in identifying who are the suspects on this anti-bribery incident. So you can also add security of the investigations and of course the security of the investigators. Of course, if they are exposed to people that might harm them, if they proceed with the investigation. Use of investigative techniques such as financial investigation into the lifestyles of the employees can be included in this anti-bribery investigation control. So after I have given to you some samples of the operational controls that you will need to establish for your anti-bribery management system to address bribery risk. So let us discuss how can we integrate this anti-bribery management system into our existing management system. And I believe most of the organizations who would like to be certified to ISO 37001 are somehow already certified to ISO 9001 standard, the quality management system. So let me show to you how can an ABMS be integrated with the QMS. So here, if you have a quality management system, and of course the quality management system is also structured using the plan, do, check, act cycle, similar to an anti-bribery management system. So you can integrate the requirements within this two system, and you can have this quality slash anti-bribery management system. So how can we do this? How can we do this? So first is if you will try to check the process map of your quality management system. So usually the process map will indicate the processes within your existing management system. And usually you will need to identify at least, you will need to identify three types of processes. The management-oriented processes, the quality or the customer-oriented processes. So we can also name it the quality-oriented processes and the support-oriented processes. So those three processes encompasses the quality management system. If we will just add the processes unique to the anti-bribery management system, and then we can integrate the anti-bribery management system with your quality management system. So here's an example of an integrated process map for a QAB or quality and anti-bribery management system. So you will have at least four processes. The management processes We'll usually have the planning process, the performance review process, internal audit process, improvement management process. That will also include the communication management process, part of the management process. So the management processes are the one who will make sure that the context are taken into consideration in establishing your management system. And when we talk about context, that would mean internal and external issues that will affect your system and the needs and expectations of the stakeholders or the interested parties. Your support-oriented processes will include the human resource management, the documented information management process, financial management process, infrastructure management process, the information and communication technology management process, including the procurement management process. The support processes, of course, manage the resources of the entire system. So manage the resources of the entire management system. So, and then you will have your customer-oriented processes, or we can call it the quality-oriented processes. So this is just an example of an organization with these processes. Of course, any organization or every organization will have a different set of customer or quality-oriented processes. For this example, we have the following. The project acquisition and the project design and development process, project planning, project execution process, project monitoring and measurement, and the project closeout process. Actually, DAP, the Development Academy of the Philippines, was initially certified against their program management process. And under their program management process, program management system, these are the processes within their program management system that was initially certified to ISO 9001. These processes, the quality-oriented processes or the customer-oriented processes, produce the products and services of the organization. So from the requirements of the customer, these processes will convert these requirements into satisfaction, into customer satisfaction by providing products and services that meet their requirements, including the applicable requirements. For the anti-bribery oriented processes, so we can add these processes that are unique to the anti-bribery oriented processes. The bribery risk assessment, the anti-bribery management system inadequacy management, the bribery incident management, the anti-bribery controls planning, and the anti-bribery controls implementation. So these anti-bribery oriented processes will need to consider the needs and expectations of the stakeholders. A while ago, I've mentioned that part of the stakeholders are the regulatory bodies, law, including your customer. The customer is part of the stakeholders. So from these needs and expectations of the stakeholders, the anti-bribery oriented processes will produce what? The intended outcomes of the anti-bribery management system. And the intended outcomes of the anti-bribery management system include prevention, detection, and response to bribery, and compliance with anti-bribery laws and obligations. So once you have produced these intended outcomes of this integrated management system, the QAB management system, the outcomes will have a feedback system going back to the management-oriented process. So any feedback coming from the receiver of our intended outcomes will be used to improve the system. So this is an example of how and the anti-bribery management system can be integrated into the existing quality management system. So how can we help you in establishing or integrating this anti-bribery management system into your existing management system? So if DAP will provide you this assistance, you will have to undergo the following major activities. The first activity would be the initial gap assessment of your existing management system. So we will need to identify what do you already have and what are the things that you will need to introduce for your anti-bribery management system. The next step is about training on the requirements of ISO 37001 and including the documentation requirements of ISO 37001. The third one, you will have a workshop on bribery risk assessment and anti-bribery management system planning. So on this workshop, you will need to identify the bribery risk on each function of your organization, and then you will need to identify what should be the controls to address this bribery risk. And then in this workshop also, you will need to establish anti-bribery risk objectives. Step number 4 is about the workshop on ABMS documentation. So since there will be additional operational controls that you will need to implement to address bribery risk, so you might need to develop procedures for these operational controls. So that will be step number 4. Step number 5. So once you have established the controls and you have initially implemented those controls, you will now have a training on anti-bribery management system. So you will need to assess your system against the requirements of the standard ISO 37001, including the requirements applicable to your organization related to anti-bribery. For example, statutory and regulatory requirements. So you will need to audit your system against those requirements. Step number 6. So we will provide, DAP will provide technical guidance on ABMS implementation. So additional guidelines. Of course, you have been provided previously, no? During the documentation, during the identification of the controls. On this step, so we will try to identify improvement areas on how you can enhance, on how you can enhance or how you can make your existing operational controls more effective in addressing bribery risk. This will also help you in preparing for the readiness assessment that will be done prior to your certification audit. Step number 7 is the internal audit of the ABMS. So internal audit of the ABMS. So right now, you're already implementing your ABMS, and we need to check whether you are implementing the ABMS in conformance or in conformity with the requirements of ISO 37001 and in compliance with the applicable legal, statutory, and regulatory requirements. So that will be your step number 7. Step number 8 is a technical guidance on management review. So since any management system standard will require organizations to have reviews on their established management system, so you will also need to review your ABMS, and we will provide technical guidance on how you will carry out this management review. What are the information that you will need to cover during your management review? And then we will also provide assistance on how you can document the results of these management reviews. Step number 9 is about readiness assessment. So right now, all the requirements, all the activities are already in place. All the requirements have been fulfilled. So prior to your certification, audit, so we need to perform this readiness assessment just to make sure that we will have a smooth flow for the certification audit. So that's step number 9. Usually, the readiness assessment will produce a report affirming your readiness for a certification audit. For step number 10, so you will now be audited by an external party. And of course, since you are now prepared for that, you can easily demonstrate to a certifying body that you have all the evidences to satisfy the requirements of ISO 37001. So this is the roadmap for integrating ISO 37001 or the ABMS into your existing management system. For example, your existing quality management system. So maybe you will ask the question, where will integration start? So integration will start in step number 1. No? Integration starts in step number 1 during the initial gap assessment. So all the opportunities for integration will be addressed all throughout the journey until your certification audit. So what will be your next step after attending this webinar? So you have taken the first step today. So we are hoping that we will see you on your next. So thank you very much. If you have questions, you can put those questions in the chat box and we will answer those questions.
All right. So there's a common question with all of the participants. I'll just combine them with Mr. Ruel Halanes, Rosalyn Adame, Rudimar Gueron, and Farida Kunanan, as well as Reinhold Abini. They're asking, in one way or another, is there a complementary of the ISO 37001 with ISO 9001 and the difference between the two? And if your agency is already certified with the 9001 standard, can you still have the 37001 standard? And if there is an integration or an integration can be done within the two systems.
All of the questions are about integration. No? The standard of ISO 9001 and the standard of ISO 37001 are designed from the same high-level structure. So they have the same number of clauses, no? 10 clauses each, no? 10 clauses for each standard. And the clauses are titled almost the same. The intention of ISO 9001 is different from the intention of ISO 37001. You can easily integrate both the standard or integrate the approaches on satisfying both standards, because they have the same structure. What are the complementarity or compatibility? So there are a lot of compatibility. One is you have to document the scope. No? So the quality management system, you have to document the scope. 37001, you have to document the scope. You will notice during the presentation of the sample scopes of certified organizations to ISO 37001, they almost have the same statement for the scope of their quality management system. Almost the same statement of the scope. So the scope is one of the compatibilities, between the two standards. Another is about risk assessment. ISO 9001, you are required to determine risks, opportunities, no? And the same with ISO 37001 about identifying bribery risk. So if you have an approach for identifying risks related to the processes of your organization, risks that will affect your operation, risks that will affect the quality of the services of your organization. So you can also make use of the same concept by assessing the bribery risk using your existing risk-based thinking tool. So what are the other compatibilities in documenting objectives? So I believe most of the organizations, most of government agencies document their objectives using this Office Performance Commitment and Review document, the OPCR. No?
Yes.
So you can also make use of the OPCR in documenting the objectives related to ABMS. No? So those are some of the compatibilities. Of course, no, internal audit, management review, corrective action. So those can be integrated into one management system. So what are the differences? So what are the differences? Because I've heard also that you're asking about the differences. So the major differences between the two standards is their intention. No? The intention of the two standards. ISO 9001, the intended outcome of ISO 9001 is customer satisfaction and, of course, to produce products and services that will meet customer requirements, including applicable requirements. So that's the intention of ISO 9001. So quality, no quality. For 37001, the intended outcome of 37001 is to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery risk and to comply with anti-bribery laws. So in the Philippines, we have a lot of anti-corruption laws, including, of course, anti-bribery laws. So those are the compatibilities and the differences. And you can integrate them in both requirements. In ISO 9001, there is a clause, no, clause number 5.1.1, letter C. In ISO 37001, 5.1.2, letter B, they are both requiring the organization to integrate the requirements of the standard into their existing business processes. So if you're already certified to ISO 9001 and there are processes related to QMS, and then if you want to be certified now with 37001, so you can integrate the requirements of 37001 into your existing processes that you have established for your quality management system. So there are really requirements for integration in both standards.
All right, sir.
Back to you, Gerard.
Thank you. So Mike
All
will
right.
be reading the second question.
Okay, the second question is from Veronica Morelos.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, can ISO 37001 2016 be only applied to the whole organization, or can just a particular service or process be certified, particularly if the process is prone to corruption?
In ISO 9001, before, there are organizations who have been certified in limited scopes because in an organization, you can have so many services. You can have so many products and services, and you only wanted to be certified to a certain product or a certain part of the service that you want to have a quality management system. For ISO 37001, I believe the intention is the same, no? Because in the requirement of ISO 37001, the requirement provides us a guideline that we have to consider the result of the risk assessment. So why do we need to consider the result of the risk assessment? If we have to assess the risk on different functions, on different processes, there might be functions that will have high risk higher than the other functions. So if we are guided, no, guided by the ISO 37001 to consider the result of the risk assessment, then we can justify that we will only apply ABMS on the processes with high bribery risk. So I believe that can be done. No? The same with ISO 9001 before. You can have a limited scope for ISO 37001.
All right. So thank you very much, Sir Tony. So we have another question. I'll combine the two from Mr. Amado Tul Jr. and Ms. Farida Kunanan. So what is the best approach for the government to have an anti-bribery management system? It required ISO for the bureaucracy, especially for those entities that have been heavily tainted by corruption. And is it not sufficient enough for the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, or RA 6713, and the Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards of Government Employees to stop the corruption in the Philippines? So why do we need to have another system or another standard to be implemented in the agency? Aren't these safeguards enough for the government?
First, of course, we have to recognize that there is a standard developed by ISO, no? International Organization for Standardization. So right now, the DTI through the Bureau of Product Standards have already adopted ISO 37001 as part of the Philippine National Standards. So first is to recognize that there is a standard. And next is learn from the private organizations, the same way that happened in ISO 9001. ISO 9001 was introduced 1987, so 33 years ago, or ISO 9001. But the Philippines have only implemented or take serious steps in implementing ISO 9001 sometime in 2007, when at the time of President GMA, she issued an executive order. I believe this is Executive Order 605, Gerard. No?
Yes, that's right.
Executive Order 605, no, from the executive branch. So since many of the agencies, most of the agencies that are tainted with corrupt practices are under the executive branch. Now, under the executive branch, I believe the next best approach is for our national government to issue an executive order for all agencies, offices under the executive branch. The same that happened for ISO 9001. So if there will be an executive order from the president, and then I believe we can effectively implement this anti-bribery management system. And of course, it will also help the citizens, the Philippine nation as a whole, to combat this menace of corruption and bribery. So I think those are the best approaches. So we will just use what we have done in the past. Okay, thank you.
All right, so I think that's all of the questions. So my name is Gerard Paul Calambro.
My name is Michael Sarabia.
I'm Tony Santos.
So on behalf of the Academy, thank you, and we hope to see you again on the PSP webinars.